The professor slammed the chalk down, smirking as the class laughed. "Solve this, and I'll resign on the spot." All eyes locked on Miles, the only black student in the room, as cameras captured his silence like it was proof of inferiority. But when he stood, slow and unblinking, the room fell dead quiet. What no one knew, he wasn't just solving a puzzle, he was about to expose a system. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The late morning light streamed through the high-arched windows of Lecture Hall B10 casting long rectangles of gold onto the polished floor. The room pulsed with energy, not from the course material, advanced logical systems, but from the man commanding the room. Professor Edwin Halgrave, a white-tenured intellectual with decades of controversial acclaim, had the attention of every soul seated in the tiered auditorium. Every eyebrow raised, every pen paused, even the recording lights on student phones blinked red, capturing every moment of what had already become more spectacle than seminar. At the center of the second row sat Miles Kingston, the only black student in the entire seminar, flanked by students who had grown used to the subtle but cutting way Halgrave taught. Miles had grown up in East Baltimore, a place where ambition often met barriers faster than opportunities. But he had broken through valedictorian, debate team champion, full scholarship to Harvard. Still in this room, among tailored blazers and inherited confidence, Miles always felt like an outlier, a variable in an equation the institution never expected. "Let's raise the stakes, shall we?" Halgrave's voice echoed sharply against the marble walls, his British-inflected tone laced with something more sinister than charm. "Today's lecture ends not with a conclusion, but with a challenge. A puzzle, one that separates thinkers from repeaters." The projector behind him lit up, revealing a dense slide of symbolic notation, logic operators, and obscure references to Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Students leaned forward, squinting at the unfamiliar arrangement. Miles recognized fragments, parts of game theory, modal logic, even an unsolved problem from a decades-old academic journal buried behind a paywall. The air shifted. Then came the line that would echo across campuses and timelines for weeks to come. "If anyone in this room can solve this puzzle," Halgrave said, his hands clasped behind his back, as if delivering a eulogy, "I'll resign, immediately. Harvard deserves nothing less than brilliance." Gasps scattered, followed quickly by laughter. Nervous, tentative, unsure if it was a joke, but Halgrave's smile confirmed it. He meant it. His eyes scanned the crowd, until they locked on Miles. "You, Mr. Kingston," he said casually, as if selecting a contestant on a game show. "You've been rather observant lately. Care to enlighten us with your critical thinking?" The room stilled. Miles didn't flinch, but the skin at the back of his neck tightened. The spotlight wasn't accidental. Over the semester, Halgrave had questioned him more than anyone else, often with veiled sarcasm or exaggerated doubt. He masked his contempt in wit, but the message was always the same: "You don't belong here." Miles exhaled slowly, resisting the flush of heat that rose in his chest. "Is this part of the syllabus?" he asked evenly, careful not to sound defensive. Halgrave chuckled, drawing more laughter from the class. "Syllabi are for the predictable. This is for minds that matter." A few students glanced at Miles, some with pity, others with amusement. Phones hovered, recording the scene. No one had stepped up to challenge Halgrave before, not like this, and now he had publicly thrown down a gauntlet impossible to ignore. Miles looked at the slide again. The puzzle wasn't just academic, it was designed, a blend of obscure logic problems, selectively lifted from obscure papers, melded into a Frankenstein problem that on the surface had no clear resolution. But there was something else, a flaw, or maybe a pattern, hidden in its arrogance. "Would you like to give it a go?" Halgrave asked again, his tone feigning politeness. "Or shall we return to the safer shores of textbook logic?" There it was, the bait wrapped in condescension. Miles felt his pulse in his throat. His mother always told him, "You don't get to blend in, you'll always have to be twice as good, just to be equal." This was the moment he had been warned about his entire life. But still, this wasn't just about logic. This was about being dared to exist, out loud, in a place that only welcomed his brilliance when it could be tamed. He leaned forward, eyes never leaving the projection. "I'll try," he said, voice low but steady. A silence dropped like a curtain. Even the laughter paused. Professor Halgrave tilted his head, clearly surprised. "Oh, You're going to attempt it? I said I'll try, Miles replied, already calculating the first layers of the puzzle in his head. Around him, the murmur began to ripple. Students shifted in their seats. Some whispered. A few smirked. But several stared intently, curiously, as if they suddenly realized this might be the first time anyone had challenged Halgrave on his own stage. The professor nodded slowly. Then please, he gestured with an open hand. The floor is yours. Miles stood up. His fingers were cold, but his spine felt straight, like it had grown steel. He didn't walk to the front. Not yet. He simply turned to the puzzle and stared, eyes moving quickly, scanning each symbol, each line, each intentional misdirection. His mind, trained on years of competitive logic, began pulling the threads apart. For a brief moment, the classroom was utterly still. Every student watching, recording, holding their breath for what they assumed would be a graceful collapse. But something in Miles' posture shifted. Not fear, not confusion. Focus. And that's when it happened. As his eyes locked on the lower left corner of the projection, he saw it, not the solution, but the lie. The flaw that proved the puzzle wasn't about solving at all. It was about performing the illusion of supremacy. A trap meant to humiliate, not challenge. And Halgrave, knowingly or not, had just exposed himself. A thunder of realization struck Miles. But he didn't speak yet. His eyes narrowed, and a new kind of calm washed over him. The kind that came from knowing you were standing on truth. Across the hall, Halgrave seemed to sense something had changed. His smile faded slightly, the room's air thickening with the unspoken shift in power. And then Miles slowly began to walk forward. Not rushed, not panicked, just deliberate. Cameras zoomed in. Pens dropped. Whispers died out. He stepped beneath the spotlight of the projector, the symbols glowing faintly over his face, like equations carved into destiny. The professor's voice cracked slightly as he asked, "Do you see the solution?" Miles didn't answer. He turned to face the chalkboard, picked up the white marker, and drew the first unexpected stroke, reversing everything. The chalk line Miles drew on the board still glowed faintly in his mind, long after he stepped out of lecture hall. His pulse had not yet settled from the confrontation, though he had tried to steady his breathing as he walked down the marble corridor lined with portraits of scholars, whose names filled textbooks but whose lives had never intersected with someone like him. He moved carefully, aware of how the air shifted around him, aware of the sudden stares that followed him, as if a boundary had been crossed, simply because he had dared to stand under the projector's light. The echoes of laughter from earlier still clung to the walls, only now mixed with suspicion and a muted curiosity, as if the building itself was recalibrating how to interpret the moment he refused to shrink. But beneath all of that, there was something darker, an old and familiar pressure that he had felt since his first day on campus, the unspoken hierarchy that separated those who naturally belonged from those who were allowed in only under conditional acceptance. The hallways of Harvard were immaculate, but the silence embedded in them was centuries old, preserved like a relic. Miles had learned quickly that silence was the school's most powerful tool. It taught students like him to measure every step, to ensure that brilliance never became too visible, and that confidence never crossed into assertiveness. It was an institution built not only on excellence but on an elegance of exclusion, one that rarely announced itself openly yet shaped every interaction. Black students were praised in brochures, photographed for diversity campaigns, celebrated in carefully curated language, but the moment they expressed dissent or outperformed expectations, the atmosphere changed. A subtle tightening, a rearranging, a reminder. Miles walked past a group of students huddled outside another lecture room, and though none of them spoke to him, the shift in posture was enough to communicate what remained unsaid. He felt as though he had stepped outside the script assigned to him. He thought of the years he had spent preparing for this institution, believing his acceptance meant equality. Yet equality here was conditional, a fragile contract requiring silence in exchange for opportunity. It became clearer as he navigated the winding halls that the legacy of Harvard was not simply intellectual mastery, but the preservation of a hierarchy disguised as academic rigor. The walls were lined with the faces of scholars who shaped national discourse, yet none of them looked like him. Their eyes painted in oil seemed to watch him with an aloof curiosity, as though observing an anomaly that had slipped through an unguarded door. Nothing in this place asked students like Miles to speak up. Everything here expected them to endure. As he reached the courtyard, a cold breeze swept through the open space and wrapped around him, chilling the fabric of his coat. Clusters of students stood beneath leafless trees, gesturing animatedly about the spectacle from earlier, their words drifting through the air, in fragments he could not fully hear, but instinctively understood. He recognized the rhythm of the whispers, the tone used when discussing something that violated tradition. The puzzle incident had already become part of campus folklore, an unexpected rupture in routine that unsettled more than just academic order. Miles sensed that this moment would not be contained within a single lecture. It had disrupted a carefully balanced social equation. Even outside, he felt the institution watching him. The campus buildings formed a ring around the courtyard like a silent jury, brick and stone towering above, each structure built on centuries of preserved elitism. Though the university celebrated progress publicly, its internal culture clung tightly to an older architecture, one constructed through exclusion and quietly maintained through generations. Miles had read about the school's past, but reading about it and living inside of it were two different worlds. Here, subtle racism functioned like gravity, omnipresent, invisible, and impossible to ignore once recognized. It showed itself in small glances professors exchanged when he raised a hand, in the forced politeness of faculty, who acted as though they were doing him a favor by acknowledging his intelligence, and in the social gatherings where white students spoke over him while pretending not to notice. Yet today something had shifted. The puzzle challenge had not simply humiliated him. It had illuminated the unwritten rules that governed who was allowed to question authority. Miles could still feel the burn of the professor's gaze when he stepped toward the board. A gaze layered with expectation not for brilliance but for failure. It was the gaze he had seen on the first day Halgrave called on him unnecessarily, the gaze that judged his accent, his background and his scholarship before evaluating his work. That gaze had been sharpened by decades of unchallenged authority, emboldened by a culture that rarely questioned the motives of those positioned at the top. Miles knew Halgrave had not expected resistance. He had expected silence. He reached the edge of the courtyard and sat on a cold stone bench, letting the tension in his shoulders loosen just enough for clarity to surface. He replayed the moment he saw the flaw in the puzzle, the instant realization that the professor's challenge had not been designed to test brilliance, but to reinforce superiority. The puzzle had been a trap meant to prove a point he had been making all semester, that students like Miles were outmatched, outclassed, and out of place. This reasoning haunted him, for it validated something he had always suspected beneath polite academic language. Harvard tolerated his presence but had never embraced his voice. As he looked around the courtyard, he noticed how the school operated on dual realities. The official one showcased diversity brochures, uplifting statements, and polished speeches about inclusion. The concealed reality, however, thrived in microaggressions, in selective opportunities, in whispered warnings that black students passed down quietly from year to year. The institution fostered a brand excellence that thrived only when its uncomfortable truths remained ignored. Miles had felt this legacy pressing on him since orientation, shaping his posture, influencing how he spoke, prompting him to calculate every reaction before it escaped his lips. He remembered the subtle advice given by upperclassmen during his first week. Avoid contradicting professors, keep your GPA immaculate, stay low profile, never appear confrontational, never let emotion slip into your arguments, and always remember that Harvard had a particular type of student it celebrated, and that type rarely looked like him. These whispers were survival strategies, echoes of generations of students who had learned that speaking loudly meant being labeled disruptive, that excelling too visibly meant being questioned, and that challenging authority meant risking everything. It was an institution that demanded brilliance yet feared, where that brilliance originated when it came from outsiders. Miles leaned back slightly, allowing the vastness of the campus to settle over him. He knew the puzzle incident was only the beginning. Something had been set in motion that neither he nor the professor could undo. His rise from the lecture seat had been a violation of tradition itself. The institution did not value boldness from him. It expected quiet compliance masked as gratitude. But he had stepped forward anyway, crossing an invisible threshold that others had quietly warned him never to approach. Across the courtyard, a group of students walked briskly, phones clutched in their hands. One of them kept glancing in his direction, not with curiosity but with the sharpened look of someone who knew more than they wished to admit. Miles sensed an unease gathering around him, an atmospheric shift that hinted at conversations unfolding somewhere beyond his awareness. He stood slowly, preparing to return to his dorm, when a vibration in his pocket jolted him. He pulled out his phone and saw a notification, one that froze him momentarily. It was a screenshot forwarded anonymously from an unknown number. The preview alone made his stomach drop. It was a group message thread titled Halgrave's Tradition Yearly Challenge, filled with names of students from previous semesters. He opened it and felt the air around him fracture. Inside the thread were detailed accounts of past challenges the professor had orchestrated, each one targeting a student of color, each one masked as academic rigor but designed for public embarrassment. The messages revealed that these incidents were organized, anticipated, even celebrated by select students who treated them as campus entertainment. They exchanged predictions, mocked the chosen students, and tracked outcomes as if it were a competitive sport. But the most chilling message was the most recent one, sent just hours before the lecture. This year he picked Kingston. Let's see if he cracks like the others. At the bottom of the thread was a final message that stopped his breath entirely. A name he recognized, someone who had disappeared from Harvard's records, paired with a warning that hinted at the real reason Halgrave targeted students like him. The message thread on Miles's phone burned into his vision long after he stopped reading. Each sentence felt like a blade, carefully honed and casually passed around among students who viewed humiliation as tradition. The group chat was old, active, and deeply organized. There were folders attached, files titled by semester, student initials, and cryptic remarks that hinted at more than just harmless teasing. But what shattered him the most was the familiarity of some of the names, people he'd seen in old campus yearbooks, heard mentioned in Black student orientation meetings, or remembered briefly before realizing they were no longer on campus. Miles sat frozen on the bench, phone still lit in his palm as the late afternoon sun shifted, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Everything around him moved on, students walking, leaves drifting, but inside him, something had splintered. The silence he had once mistaken for institutional elegance was now fully unmasked, as strategic erasure. The puzzle incident wasn't an isolated humiliation. It was part of a ritual, and he wasn't the first. Unable to breathe without trembling, Miles stood and walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the administration wing. Not out of clarity but instinct. His thoughts weren't yet organized into strategy. He wasn't ready for revenge or reform. He was simply trying to understand how deep the rot went. The corridor into the East Building held portraits of former deans and trustees, all sharply dressed men who gazed down with expressions too proud to be welcoming. He avoided their stares and headed instead for a side stairwell known mostly to students who needed quiet space to think or hide. Miles ended up in the university library archives, housed in a cooled basement room beneath Widener Library, a place so untouched it smelled like sealed paper and old decisions. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for, only that something in his gut insisted he dig deeper. What if the chat thread wasn't even the whole story? What if the ritual stretched further back than the age of group texts and leaked screenshots? He approached the aging librarian, a man whose quiet nod indicated he recognized Miles, but would not ask questions. Miles requested access to archived lecture footage under the guise of academic review. The tapes weren't digitized. Harvard's arrogance extended even to its record-keeping. Physical tapes, cataloged by course number and semester, filled labeled drawers like fossils in a museum. Miles sifted through them methodically. At first it was ordinary. Seminars on classical logic, debates, guest lectures, but then a pattern emerged. In nearly every fall semester going back at least 12 years, Professor Halgrave had dedicated one lecture to what was described on the index card as a challenge session. The notes always read the same: special session, student interaction, live demo. Miles inserted a tape from 6 years ago and pressed play. The footage crackled to life, revealing a younger Halgrave in the same hall. B102 hadn't changed. The lighting, the seating arrangement, even the smug pacing was identical. At the front of the room stood a black student, visibly uncomfortable, attempting to make sense of an impossible equation projected behind him. The student was isolated, the crowd watching with veiled amusement, the professor clearly entertained. Miles watched as the young man hesitated, offered a partial explanation, then finally sat down to sparse dismissive applause. Halgrave offered a one-liner, and the room erupted in laughter. The pattern was undeniable. Tape after tape, year after year, told the same story. Black students were hand-picked for public challenges, always under the guise of academic rigor, always recorded, always ending in some variation of ridicule or silence. Occasionally students resisted some more confidently than others, but the outcome never changed. There were no tapes of white students facing such scrutiny. Not one. Miles felt sick. This wasn't education. It was institutional theater. And worse, it was tradition. As he pulled another tape, fall 2012, he recognized the initials scrawled on the label. JAT, He remembered those initials from the leaked chat thread. They belonged to a student whose name appeared on an old Black student union list, but who had since vanished from university records. The tape played shakily, and there he was, a confident young man in a navy sweater, standing under the projector light, answering Halgrave's baited questions with precision and clarity. For a moment, it seemed different. He was holding his own, and even Halgrave's tone appeared briefly respectful. Then something shifted. The student made a correction, called out a mistake in the puzzle's premise. The room quieted. Halgrave's posture changed. The student stood taller, began writing his own version of the problem on the board. What followed was subtle, but unmistakable. Halgrave interrupted him mid-explanation, accused him of intellectual dishonesty, and dismissed the correction as irrelevant. The student tried to push back, but Halgrave turned to the class, cracked a joke, and steamrolled the moment. The student's face fell, his voice trailed off, and the rest of the footage blurred into tension and awkwardness. It ended with the student packing his bag in silence. The camera cut as he left the room. There was no record of JAT enrolling in the following semester. Miles sat back, overwhelmed not just by the footage, but by the weight of the conspiracy hiding in plain sight. Halgrave had created a legacy of academic lynching, each event sanitized as part of curriculum, each victim made to believe they had failed on their own. And Harvard had allowed it. The idea that this pattern had gone unchecked was almost more infuriating than the act itself. The administration had watched these tapes. Students had laughed. Faculty had signed off on the lecture titles. And every year a new target was chosen. The ritual didn't just preserve Halgrave's authority. It reinforced Harvard's unwritten rule that Black students could participate, but never ascend. Miles gathered the tapes into a bag, his hands trembling with more than rage. He felt a new kind of clarity rising inside him, a resolve tempered by grief. What was once a humiliating classroom incident had now morphed into an indictment of an entire system. But just as he reached to shut the final drawer, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't another message from the anonymous number. It was an email. No subject line, no name, just a timestamp from 7 minutes ago. He opened it cautiously. Inside was a single paragraph, typed, unsigned, yet hauntingly direct. He almost destroyed me. Don't let him finish you. I tried to report him once. They buried it. I never came back. Check your email again in 10 minutes. I'm sending you proof. Attached was a file name, Hargrave Confidential Confession, .mp3. As Miles clicked to download the file, another notification appeared. A system alert from the university's intranet. His email access had just been suspended. The screen froze on Miles's laptop the moment the download began. The audio file that had just appeared in his inbox, a lifeline from a vanished student, was halfway through transferring, when his session abruptly terminated. A blinking red error took its place. Then a forced logout. A second later, his university email dashboard grayed out entirely, replaced by a message too clean, too fast to be coincidental. Access suspended. Contact system admin. His heart slammed against his ribs. The implications immediate. Someone inside the system had noticed. That meant someone was watching. And worse, someone was responding. Miles stared at the screen for a full minute, motionless. The only thing that moved was his reflection flickering on the darkened screen. A reflection of himself alone in the archive basement, surrounded by decades of covered truths, holding a bag filled with analog evidence. The university had quietly hoped no one would revisit. The room's silence wasn't peaceful now. It was suffocating. He knew the walls were not soundproof, but the air felt so still it might as well have been a vault. He was no longer just a student who had embarrassed a professor. He was now a problem that needed managing. Above him, the world hadn't paused. In fact, it had accelerated. The 30-second clip from the classroom, recorded by one of the students and uploaded without context, had already detonated online. By the time Miles reached the top of the stairwell and stepped back into the main library, the video had spread beyond campus, first to TikTok, then to Twitter, then across Instagram stories, group chats and reaction threads. The caption that traveled with it was simple, deliberate and unforgiving. Harvard professor challenges Black student to quit worthy puzzle. Then this happened. Hashtags began to erupt like sparks catching dry wood. Puzzle of privilege. Harvard trap. Racial rigor. Academic humiliation. Each tag birthed new sub-narratives. Some claimed it was clearly racist. Others argued it was performance art. Influencers dissected the clip frame by frame, analyzing facial expressions, tone shifts, and body language. They zoomed in on Halgrave's smirk, on the way Miles had hesitated before standing, on how the professor never expected to be challenged. It became a digital event, another flashpoint in the culture war, this time staged on ivy-covered ground. By nightfall, Miles' name was trending nationally, but with attention came backlash. His personal inbox, already slow from spam filters, was now on fire. Messages came faster than he could open them. Some praising him for bravery, others accusing him of playing the race card. Anonymous accounts sent thinly veiled threats, warning him to stop digging. A few messages pretended to offer scholarships or internships, until he looked closer and saw they were phishing attempts meant to compromise his data. Someone had posted his student ID number. Another had posted an address, an old one, but still too close for comfort. Miles' phone buzzed non-stop. Unknown numbers, calls from blocked IDs, interview requests from news outlets that knew more about the viral clip than the real story behind it. But what hit him hardest weren't the trolls or the opportunists. It was the silence from Harvard. No statement, no message of support, no acknowledgement that anything had happened. For an institution that regularly pushed out carefully crafted statements about diversity and equity, their stillness was deafening. Miles knew what that silence meant. They were calculating, assessing, watching to see if the storm would pass before committing to a position. Harvard didn't respond to moments. It responded to metrics. He sat in his dorm later that night with the lights off, the soft glow of his phone screen lighting the walls. His mind split between paranoia and strategy. He thought of the files he had pulled from the archive, of how many years the pattern had gone unnoticed, or worse, unchallenged. He knew now that the tapes alone wouldn't be enough. In a digital world, analog evidence was easy to ignore. He needed something irrefutable. He needed that audio file, the confession from the student who had almost been destroyed. His mind circled back to the last sentence of the email. Check your email again in 10 minutes. I'm sending you proof. But with his account suspended, that message was locked beyond his reach. He tried resetting his password through the university portal, but even that path was blocked. His entire digital identity as a student had been quietly paused, as if the university had hit a mute button on his existence. And then just past 1 a.m., a new notification buzzed through his phone. Not from Harvard, but from a private Proton mail address. No name, no subject, just a download link, and a note. They know you accessed the archive. They're moving to protect him. You need to see what's in the vault. At first he thought it was another trap, another attempt to hack him. But the phrasing, the timing, and the reference to the archive footage he had watched hours earlier were too specific. Whoever this was, they weren't guessing. They knew, and they were trying to help. Miles clicked the link. It redirected him to a secure cloud folder titled Halgrave Vault 2. Inside were dozens of compressed files, scanned emails, internal memos, unofficial meeting notes, even draft syllabi with handwritten notes in the margins. But one folder caught his eye immediately. It was named Non-Enrolled Incidents. He opened it. Dozens of names, dates, short summaries. 2015, SC withdrew after challenge incident. 2012 JAT, disputed Halgrave in class. Disappeared. 2009, or L, filed complaint. No further enrollment record. 208, DB, deemed unfit for continuation. It wasn't just a pattern. It was a purge. Students of color who challenged Halgrave weren't just publicly humiliated. They were quietly removed. Their records redacted, their credits frozen, or their scholarships revoked, under vague academic pretexts. And it wasn't always instant. Sometimes the pressure came gradually, advisors steering them toward withdrawal. Mysterious errors in transcripts, a mounting list of micro-failures, designed to make them give up voluntarily. The real horror wasn't in the initial act. It was in the machinery behind it. Polished, institutional, polite, and precise. Suddenly, Miles realized he hadn't just found evidence of systemic targeting. He had stumbled onto a strategy of academic erasure. A way the university maintained its power not by denying access but by controlling who lasted long enough to graduate. But then came the twist. Among the files was a name that didn't fit the pattern. Dr. Elaine Crosby. Not a student, a faculty member. A quick search pulled up her photo. White, tenured, soft-spoken. Miles had seen her once, at an open forum on racial equity. quietly taking notes while others debated loudly. Her name appeared next to a file labeled Internal Dissent, sealed. Inside was a transcript from a private faculty meeting, held 6 years ago. Crosby had raised concerns about Halgrave's classroom experiments, calling them discriminatory and damaging. The notes showed she had been advised to retract her comments. When she refused, she was placed on sabbatical and never returned to teaching full-time. Her name had all but vanished from public faculty directories. This wasn't just about students anymore. The institution silenced anyone who disrupted its constructed narrative. Whistleblowers, professors, even internal ethics reviewers, if they spoke out against Halgrave, they disappeared too. Miles sat back, his heart heavy but steady. He knew now that he wasn't up against a single professor. He was up against an ecosystem, a culture of curated silence wrapped in the aesthetics of prestige. As he backed out of the folder to collect everything into a secure drive, a new live message popped up from the Proton Mail contact. Vault's been flagged. They know someone accessed it. You have hours before it disappears. Decide fast. The air in the administration's off-limits sub-basement felt colder than the rest of campus. Not the kind of cold that came from faulty vents or winter drafts, but the kind that seemed to cling to walls built to hold things still. As Miles stepped past the thick double doors he'd unlocked using a student's borrowed keycard and a risk he hadn't thought through, he felt like he was crossing into something deliberately hidden. The vault wasn't just a physical space, it was a mentality, a zone designed for forgetting, for storage without accountability. No windows, no cameras, just silence and secret. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, washing the narrow aisles in a pale, almost clinical glow. The rows stretched deeper than expected, labeled not by department or year, but by internal classifications. Things like add-in review, discipline, faculty correspondence, private, and most ominously, grievances. Each drawer and file cabinet felt like a grave, where someone's future had been laid to rest under bureaucratic language in sealed envelopes. Miles moved quickly, heart pounding, the sound of his own breath sharp in his ears as he scanned the rows. He didn't know how long he had. The warning had been clear. You have hours before it disappears. He found the drawer labeled Archive E1, one of the few physical references connected to Halgrave's name, based on metadata from the folder he'd accessed the night before. It took effort to pry the heavy cabinet open. Inside, a series of folders sat tightly packed, some with edges worn and tab titles yellowed. Miles's fingers hesitated over the first one, labeled with a name he didn't recognize. L.M. Carter, 2003, case closed. He opened it. Inside was a complaint, written in formal language by a former student, detailing racial bias and targeting in Halgrave's classroom. Attached were multiple pages of typed statements, including descriptions of verbal humiliation, unequal grading, and punitive in-class challenges. Even more shocking was a notarized affidavit from another student, corroborating the experience. At the back of the file was a memo from the dean's office, short and dispassionate. Insufficient grounds for investigation. Faculty protected under Academic Freedom Clause. Beneath it, a red stamp. Closed. Miles moved on to the next folder. Then another. Each one echoed the same theme. Testimonies silenced. Patterns ignored. Systems shielding Halgrave under the illusion of tradition. Students of color, primarily black, had been coming forward for over 2 decades, many before social media even existed to amplify their stories. Yet nothing had changed. Every folder read like a chapter in a book of denial. There were emails from parents, letters from student support groups, even handwritten notes from counseling services urging administration to intervene. All of it buried, none of it acted upon. As he turned through the pages, the realization sank in. Halgrave hadn't just operated with impunity. He had thrived because the system required someone like him, someone who embodied the myth of academic superiority, someone who knew how to veil harm in eloquence, who turned the classroom into a quiet arena of control. And the institution didn't just protect him, it partnered with him. He found letters from donors, thanking Halgrave for maintaining the rigor of Harvard's program. Some of those donors had names Miles recognized from political campaigns, national headlines, even judgeships. It went beyond campus walls. This wasn't one man's misconduct. It was cultural complicity. Near the back of the cabinet, Miles located a separate binder, unlabeled, dusty and unusually thick. He opened it carefully, revealing correspondence between Halgrave and elite academic journals, many of which he had cited in his own thesis proposal. But this time, the subject wasn't research, it was student profiling. Halgrave had kept informal notes on students he deemed unfit for advanced theory, many of whom were Black or Latino. Their names were followed by coded remarks. Emotionally reactive, defers to intuition over logic, background affects objectivity. These were not academic criticisms, they were racialized reductions masked as evaluation. Miles felt his throat tighten. He knew the cost of being told you were emotional in a setting that worshipped objectivity. Knew what it meant to be read as defiant instead of analytical. Knew how invisible lines were drawn, not in policy, but in perception. What he didn't know, until now, was that these judgments had been recorded, circulated, and used as a metric in professional recommendation. As he reached the final drawer, hands shaking from more than cold, he pulled out a folder thicker than the others. On the tab written in neat type, Scholarship Review, Priority Cases. He flipped through its pages, scanning the internal memos, detailing student evaluations across scholarship recipients, considered at risk of misalignment with institutional ethos. It was bureaucratic language, but the implications were unmistakable. They tracked students who spoke out, who organized, who challenged too often, or too publicly. The names included some who had appeared in the chat thread from earlier, and then he saw it, his own name, Kingston, Miles J. Beside it, his ID number, scholarship status, and academic standing. But the final note chilled him. In red ink, stark against the page's white, track for removal. The blood rushed from his face. His vision narrowed. For a second, the paper in his hand trembled so hard he nearly dropped it. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't imagined. The system had him marked, not for poor grades, not for misconduct, but for challenging the structure itself. He read on. The note was dated 2 weeks before the puzzle incident. The page detailed concerning behavior, a summary of his rising profile among Black student leaders, references to him disrupting standard classroom flow, and citations from anonymous faculty, concerned about tone in class discussions. No academic violation, just perception framed as threat. In that moment, Miles understood. The puzzle wasn't just a moment of public humiliation. It was a trigger, carefully timed. They'd already decided he was a risk. All that was left was for him to be discredited publicly, so the rest could happen quietly. Withdrawal, loss of scholarship, academic failure by administrative design. But just as he began to fold the paper into his pocket, his eyes caught a loose photograph wedged between the back pages. He slid it out slowly. It was grainy, taken from a classroom projector screen, but it was unmistakably Lecture Hall B. Polbo. At the podium stood Halgrave, and at the front row, head bowed, sat a Black student Miles didn't recognize. On the back of the photo, scribbled hastily in pen, were the words, "We warned them." He escalated. They covered it. No name. No date. Miles quickly photographed every document he could with his phone, knowing the digital copies were now more valuable than gold. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something else. An entire shelf labeled simply "Confidential, Legacy Admissions." His pulse quickened. He hadn't come looking for that, but the proximity couldn't be ignored. He stepped closer. The folders were thicker, sealed with wire clasps, but one had come slightly ajar. Inside were internal memos showing how legacy students were funneled into elite programs, despite underperformance. In contrast to the scholarship review files, these students had glowing handwritten notes. Great family, will evolve with maturity, strong social ties, room for growth. The double standard was glaring, grotesque. It wasn't just about protecting Halgrave anymore. The institution had layers of insulation, one that guarded power, race, wealth, and perception. The myth of meritocracy was a house of cards, and Miles had found the fan. As he snapped the last photo and quietly closed the drawer, footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway outside the vault. Slow, intentional, not the shuffle of a passing student. This was someone walking with purpose. Miles's breath hitched. He turned off the lights inside the vault, tucking himself behind a cabinet, praying his phone didn't buzz. The door creaked open. A narrow beam of light sliced through the darkness. The voice that followed was quiet, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here." It was Halgrave. Alone. In the archive. The sound of Halgrave's voice in the archive room cut through the darkness like a scalpel. Sharp, precise, and meant to wound without leaving blood. Miles didn't move. Every muscle in his body went still, his back pressed flat against the metal cabinet, breath shallow. The light from Halgrave's flashlight passed inches from his feet. He heard the slow scrape of dress shoes on concrete, deliberate, and measured. The professor wasn't searching. He was surveying, walking through a space he believed belonged to him, confident that nothing here could challenge his authority, not even a trespasser. But then, just as quickly as he'd entered, Halgrave left. No slamming of doors, no words, just a cold retreat, footsteps echoing down the hallway until the vault fell silent once more. Miles waited, counting the seconds, letting his body thaw from the paralysis of fear. When he was sure Halgrave was gone, he emerged slowly, gathered his things, and slipped out a side exit, heart thundering in his chest. By morning, the story had evolved. Not the one Miles was piecing together with evidence and patterns, the one the world was watching. Overnight, news outlets that had initially shared the viral video with neutral headlines began shifting tone. Subtle at first, Harvard students' classroom protest sparks controversy. Then more aggressive, disruptive student draws national attention after confrontation. Editorials began surfacing with language like entitled, emotional, and unprofessional. They questioned his character, not the professor's conduct. They referenced vague past infractions that didn't exist. They quoted anonymous classmates who described Miles as combative, hard to work with, and obsessed with race. It wasn't random. It was coordinated. Behind the changing narrative was the invisible hand of Harvard's most powerful asset, its alumni network. A brotherhood more enduring than any curriculum, more protective than any legal team. CEOs, judges, media executives, political strategists, all linked by a common thread: prestige, tradition, and control. Miles began noticing the shift everywhere. His scheduled podcast interview with a black media platform was suddenly postponed due to scheduling conflicts. A long-promised op-ed slot in a progressive magazine was pulled with no explanation. And his mentor, Dr. Reginald Bauer, the only senior faculty member who had ever publicly supported him, was gone. His office door was locked, his name removed from the staff directory. Rumors swirled about health issues and sabbatical. But Miles knew what exile looked like. Behind the scenes, the Brotherhood was mobilizing. Not in suits and ties, but in phone calls, in silent funding decisions, in whispered conversations with editors and administrators. They didn't have to attack Miles directly. They just had to unmake him, piece by piece, until what remained was a version of him no one would believe. It worked in insidious layers. Professors stopped making eye contact. Group projects he was once part of were reassigned without notice. He was removed from a student advisory committee he had helped build. Even friends, peers he had eaten with, studied with, began pulling away. Not out of malice, but fear. They'd seen what happened to others who stood too close to controversy. At Harvard, distance was survival. Miles kept documenting everything. The files from the archive, the screenshots of edited headlines, the anonymous emails. But no matter how much he gathered, the noise from the outside world grew louder than his truth. His social media was a battlefield. Supporters clashed with detractors. Hashtags were drowned in counter-narratives. Fake accounts surfaced pretending to be him, posting inflammatory comments, following alt-right figures, stirring chaos. The algorithm didn't care about accuracy. It only cared about engagement. Then came the sponsors. Organizations that had once celebrated Miles as a rising academic star began retracting their endorsements. A nonprofit that had awarded him a competitive fellowship emailed to inform him that his recent conduct raised concerns incompatible with their values. An internship with a top tech policy firm disappeared overnight. No call, no explanation, just a silent revocation. He wasn't being punished. He was being erased. It became clear that this wasn't just about Halgrave anymore. The professor had merely lit the match. The Brotherhood had turned it into a controlled burn. Miles wasn't just threatening a man. He was threatening a structure that relied on selective memory, on clean narratives, on a pipeline of black success that stayed grateful, polished, and quiet. Miles refused. He leaned into the storm. He posted fragments of the documents, blurred for legal reasons, but enough to raise eyebrows. He hinted at names. He created a timeline. He shared redacted versions of the vault files, showing years of buried complaints. He posted the note, track for removal, and slowly, the narrative began to fracture again. Independent journalists reached out. Activist lawyers offered assistance. Alumni from outside the Brotherhood, the ones who had survived but never thrived, started sending their own stories. That's when it happened. Late one night, as Miles sat in the quiet of a student lounge, with his laptop open, sifting through old meeting notes from the scholarship review board, a new message appeared. The sender's name was encrypted, The subject line read, "You're not the first." Miles opened it. The message was brief, direct. "I've been following what's happening. I tried to publish the same story 2 years ago. My source died in a car accident 3 days before we went to print. He had documents that never made it out of the vault. His name was Darren Westbrook. I think you've already seen his file. Be careful, they play clean only when they're winning." Attached was a single photo. A student ID, worn, slightly cracked, belonging to Darren Westbrook. Miles recognized the face immediately. It matched one of the students from the older complaint folders in the archive. The one who had written one of the most detailed affidavits against Halgrave. The one who had been labeled withdrawn for emotional instability. The one who had vanished from campus mid-semester. Until now, Miles had believed that removal meant academic exile. But this was something else. He clicked through the sender's secure message thread. There were no other messages, no reply option. It was one way. Whoever this journalist was, they had taken risks to reach out. And the implication of their words was chilling. Darren hadn't just vanished. He had been silenced permanently. Miles sat frozen, the dim blue light of his screen reflecting in his eyes. The idea of coincidence collapsed under the weight of everything he'd seen. The Brotherhood didn't just discredit dissenters. In extreme cases, they erased them entirely. His heart pounded harder now, not just from fear, but from responsibility. The files he had, the evidence, the pattern. If he backed down now, if he let their smear campaign win, Darren's death would remain a whisper lost in ivy-covered walls. At that moment, a second message appeared, this one from a new anonymous address. "They know you opened the vault. You're being watched. Don't go back to your dorm tonight." The second message hit Miles harder than the first, not because of what it said, but because of how clearly it confirmed what he already suspected. He had crossed a line, and someone powerful wanted it undone. The warning was simple: don't return to his dorm. The place meant to be his shelter now felt like a trap. Miles quickly packed the essentials: laptop, drives, copies of his archive photos, and slipped into the shadows of the campus, staying under street lamps only when necessary. He didn't go home. Instead, he stayed with Deshawn, a senior from the Black Student Union, who had already been quietly radicalized by years of quiet microaggressions and academic gatekeeping. They didn't talk much that night. There was no need. Silence was a language all their own now. Morning brought cold clarity. Fear no longer sat at the center of Miles's chest. Strategy did. The system was weaponizing its influence. It was dismantling his reputation, erasing support, and ghosting his academic path. He knew this tactic well. It was generational, but Harvard's mistake wasn't targeting him. It was assuming he'd be isolated. When they did, what the Brotherhood failed to consider was how many students were already watching, how many had been waiting for someone to push first. Miles called a meeting at sunrise with every Black student leader he trusted. They gathered inside an old humanities classroom. Locked from the inside, blinds pulled, a whiteboard scribbled with strategy lines that mirrored battle maps more than student activism. He laid out the proof, photos, timelines, documents, and by the time he finished, no one questioned him. The facts weren't just compelling, they were devastating. The plan formed quickly, a coordinated silent walkout during Halgrave's lecture. Not a chant, not a shout, just presence. Then absence. Silence as defiance. Black students from every department would attend the lecture, fill the room entirely, and then midway through stand and leave. A statement not against logic or education, but against the weaponization of both. It wasn't about proving racism anymore. It was about showing its limits. Word spread faster than anyone anticipated. What started as a quiet idea leaked through group chats, social threads, and ally networks. Within hours, students of color, sympathetic professors, and even journalists caught wind of the plan. But the administration caught it too. By midday, Miles received an official email from the Dean of Students, warning him against unauthorized disruption of academic protocol. The language was clean, polished, but saturated with threat. This was Harvard's polite way of saying, cross this line, and we'll remove you permanently. The message didn't deter him. It confirmed the stakes. By the time Halgrave's lecture began, the energy on campus had thickened. Lecture Hall B102, usually filled with high-ranking scholars and overachievers, was now populated almost exclusively by Black students, seated in organized rows, eyes forward, bodies calm. Some wore plain black shirts, others wore nothing symbolic at all, just themselves, fully present in a space that had long worked to make them invisible. Halgrave walked in late. Miles watched him closely, noting the brief flicker of unease that crossed his face as he scanned the room. For once, the professor's usual confidence didn't land. Something about the silence unnerved him. He began the lecture stiffly, avoiding eye contact, falling back on slides and formulas that now felt too mechanical, too rehearsed. The students didn't engage, they just listened. 20 minutes in, Miles checked the time. Then he stood, and without a word, so did the rest. Row by row, seat by seat, the students rose, not like a wave, but like an earthquake, steady and unshakable. They walked out together, expressionless, disciplined. Phones captured every second, streamed live across platforms. The moment transcended protest. It became performance, an act of resistance scripted by lived experience. Halgrave didn't move. His hands gripped the edges of his podium. No words came, only silence surrounded him now. Outside, cameras were already waiting. The footage of the walkout spread in real time, a counter-narrative to the smear campaign that had taken root days earlier. Hashtags resurfaced, influencers shared the footage, celebrities commented. The silence of the protest did what no speech could, exposed the institution's discomfort with being confronted on terms it couldn't twist. But then came the backlash. Hours after the walkout, the university issued a public statement, not acknowledging the protest's cause, but condemning unauthorized disruptions that violated institutional decorum. It labeled the act as a coordinated interference with classroom instruction. Miles was summoned for a disciplinary review. 3 other students were threatened with academic probation. An email leaked from the provost's office, suggesting that Harvard would consider enforcing behavioral expulsion if further protests occurred. Still, the story refused to fade, and then the unthinkable happened. That evening, outside a neighboring building where student protesters gathered, a female student, Asha Monroe, was pinned to the ground by campus security after refusing to disperse. The footage was captured on a smartphone and uploaded within minutes. Asha's face was visible, twisted in pain as a guard drove his knee into her back, shouting at her to stay down. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't armed. She was crying. The clip ignited like gasoline on fire. National outrage followed within hours. News anchors played the video on repeat. Civil rights lawyers condemned the university. Hashtags like "Protect Black Students" and "Justice for Asha" exploded. Protesters took to the gates of Harvard. Then beyond, across Ivy League campuses, students walked out in solidarity. What began as an academic resistance had transformed into a human rights reckoning. Miles stood at the center of it all, but felt no triumph. He watched Asha's parents arrive on campus, watched administrators fumble through interviews, watched media outlets try to balance coverage while avoiding direct blame. He saw the face of a young woman who had simply wanted to make her presence known, and instead was reduced to a body on the ground. He felt the weight of it like a stone on his chest. That night, he returned to campus alone. He hadn't planned to, but he needed to retrieve a book, one that contained a reference to a buried academic code he believed might help him counter the university's pending disciplinary action. It was late. The building was mostly empty. The halls were still. When he reached his dorm room, the door was ajar. His breath caught. He knew he hadn't left it that way. Slowly, he stepped inside. Nothing looked disturbed. No drawers open. No books displaced. The lights were off. Everything was where it should be, except for the desk. On its surface, placed precisely in the center, was a plain white envelope. No postage. No name. Just a single handwritten line across its front. "He knows you're getting close." Inside the envelope wasn't paper but a flash drive. And on it, a single file named "Recorded Meeting, March 12, Faculty Only." The flash drive felt heavier than it should have, though it weighed no more than a coin. Miles held it in his hand as if it were alive, as if the data inside pulsed with danger. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of his laptop. He hadn't turned on the overhead light. Something about the darkness made it easier to breathe, easier to prepare. The label on the file was blunt: "Recorded Meeting, March 12, Faculty Only." He recognized the date. It was the same day the university had issued a generic campus-wide memo about sustaining ethical excellence. At the time it had sounded like empty PR. Now it read like a warning cloaked in sophistication. When he clicked play, the audio hissed into life, distorted slightly, as though recorded from inside a coat pocket. It was a closed-door meeting, the kind reserved for damage control. Not for discussion, not for resolution, but for strategic silence. No press, no students, no public minutes, just administration, faculty, and legal counsel. The first voice came clipped and confident. A faculty liaison, likely someone from the Board of Academic Affairs, opened the meeting by reciting the purpose of the emergency hearing. Internal review of the growing controversy surrounding Professor Edwin Halgrave and the protests led by Miles Kingston. But the tone was not inquisitive, it was defensive. There was no interest in determining the truth, only in measuring fallout. Miles listened, his chest tightening with every second. They discussed optics, not ethics. They weighed how to handle media pressure, not misconduct. One administrator, likely a member of the university's legal team, suggested issuing a neutral statement that emphasized Harvard's commitment to free speech, while not admitting fault. The phrase "no legal admission of wrongdoing" repeated several times, like a mantra. Another voice, older, more weary, floated the idea of placing Halgrave on temporary leave to create the illusion of accountability. But that idea was immediately rejected, not because of the professor's rights, but because of what it would signal to donors. Miles paused the audio and sat back, stunned by the bluntness of it all. There was no coded language here. No careful phrasing. These weren't sound bites for public consumption. These were the raw calculations of power trying to protect itself. When he pressed play again, the voices grew sharper. The provost discussed Miles directly, not as a student with valid grievances, but as a threat vector. The term they used was high-risk actor, the kind of label typically applied to national security, now affixed to a college student seeking transparency. One faculty member raised concerns that if Miles wasn't expelled, it would set a precedent for future student protests, implying that his example might embolden others to confront institutional bias. That apparently was the real emergency. And then came the most jarring part. Professor Halgrave himself spoke. Calm, articulate, and utterly unapologetic. He didn't deny anything. He framed his actions as pedagogical challenges, repeated the phrase, academic rigor, and insisted his teaching methods had been consistent for decades. He described Miles as volatile, disruptive, and easily influenced by the politicized climate of social media. The others in the room didn't challenge him. They nodded, sighed, or remained quiet. In that silence, Miles heard the weight of institutional loyalty. They weren't protecting Halgrave because he was innocent. They were protecting him because he belonged. As the meeting dragged on, the conversation shifted to public strategy. A media consultant briefed the panel on the rapidly spreading narrative online, describing it as a brand risk. The consultant advised preemptively framing Miles as part of a larger activist movement that had an agenda beyond the classroom incident. The aim was to reframe the story, not as a professor exploiting racial hierarchies, but as a student overreacting in a politically charged era. Miles felt his stomach twist. They were rewriting his story in real time. Not because they had a better version of events, but because they had better tools. Platforms. People. Money. The audio skipped briefly, static rising for a moment, before settling. The next voice belonged to the university's ethics chair. She sounded tired, as if pulled between conscience and consequence. She warned that if the truth came out, about the archives, the pattern of past complaints, the faculty cover-ups, Harvard would face legal and reputational collapse. Her suggestion was simple: settle with Miles quietly, buy his silence, expunge the record, and spin it as mutual understanding. But it was too late for that. Miles had no interest in being erased with a handshake and a sealed NDA. As the meeting neared its end, the mood shifted from strategy to urgency. They discussed donor relations, alumni backlash, potential financial repercussions, and even a threatened lawsuit from a former professor who claimed she had been silenced years ago for speaking out about the same issues. The conversation turned darker. They feared a chain reaction. One administrator warned, if Miles exposed the internal files, it could trigger a federal investigation into not just racial bias, but scholarship fraud, legacy admissions, and intellectual retaliation. Then the voice of the dean entered the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He reminded the room of Harvard's historical role, not just as an institution of learning, but as a symbol of power. He stated without hesitation that protecting that legacy was the highest priority. His final words on the recording were clear, measured, and terrifying. He said Harvard could not afford to let one student's personal crusade unravel centuries of reputation. That this was not about truth, but about stability. And then, after a long pause, He ended the meeting with a sentence that Miles replayed 3 times to be sure he'd heard it correctly. "We need to protect the brand, not the boy." Miles froze. There was no misinterpretation. The line wasn't a slip. It was a doctrine. They didn't see him as a student, not even as a problem, just as a liability. He closed the laptop gently, his heart pounding. The proof was no longer just anecdotal. He had a recorded confession, not of guilt in the traditional sense, but of intention, the kind that couldn't be refuted in a press statement or buried in legalese. It was a window into the institution's soul, and what he saw was rot. But what chilled him more was what it meant. They weren't trying to destroy him out of hatred. They were doing it out of necessity. And if he went public with the recording, if he released it, the stakes would escalate. No more academic threats, no more suspension games. It would move into something else, something colder, more permanent. As he sat in the stillness of the room, wondering how to proceed, his phone buzzed again. A new message. No sender ID, just a file attachment, and a short line of text. The file was labeled, "Withdrawal Agreement, prepared in advance." The message read, "If you release that recording, be ready to vanish like the others. We've done this before." The withdrawal agreement sat open on Miles's screen, like a death certificate written in neutral fonts. It was a pre-filled PDF, complete with digital signature lines, time-stamped 3 days prior. The language was predictably sterile, phrases like voluntary academic departure, personal reassessment, and amicable severance of student relationship. But the meaning was unmistakable. They weren't asking him to leave. They were preparing to erase him, whether he signed or not. His name would be wiped from class rosters, his ID deactivated, his credits nullified. A ghost before graduation. But Miles didn't close the file. Not yet. His eyes drifted back to the phrase that had triggered everything, the logic puzzle. In the chaos that had followed, the protests, the archive, the media storm, one truth had never left him. The puzzle wasn't real, not in the way it had been presented. And deep down, he knew it hadn't just been meant to humiliate him. It had been engineered to fail him. On purpose. That night he revisited the footage frame by frame. His walk to the board. The equation Halgrave had presented. The reactions of students around him. But this time he paused on the exact moment the puzzle lit up on the projector. He zoomed into the image. Symbols. Yes. Operators. Abstract structures. But embedded in the middle, almost camouflaged, were variables that didn't align with modern formulations. Notations long abandoned by contemporary mathematicians. It was more than obscure. It was antiquated. Miles pulled out his old notebooks, flipped through pages of problem sets he had mastered during undergrad. Nothing resembled the symbols used in that lecture. He went deeper, pulling archival math journals online, scanning articles from the 1980s, then the 70s. Still no match. Finally, in an obscure repository of declassified Cold War logic papers digitized by a niche academic project, he found something. A footnote referencing a structure called Dreadwell sequence theorem, version 0, last seen in 1963, abandoned due to its inapplicability in modern systems. That was it. Halgrave hadn't created a test. He had recreated a trap, built from a theoretical model, buried so far in the past, it would be inaccessible to any current student, unless they had access to restricted departmental material. Miles leaned in, heart accelerating. The Dreadwell sequence wasn't public curriculum. It wasn't even available in modern textbooks. Yet Halgrave had embedded it into a supposedly impromptu challenge, knowing full well no student in the room could possibly have the background to identify it, unless they had privileged access to archived professor-only theory logs. It was a revelation that changed everything. The puzzle's failure wasn't Miles' lack of intelligence. It was his lack of institutional privilege. Miles accessed the internal system using a password he'd been given weeks ago by a sympathetic IT assistant who had since disappeared from campus without explanation. Inside the faculty-only archives, he searched Dreadwell. Only one result appeared. A 1964 document labeled Restricted Instructional Models, for evaluation use only. Author Edwin Halgrave, PhD candidate at the time. Halgrave had studied the Dreadwell structure. He'd written about it, but he hadn't published it in journals. He'd kept it private, controlled, obscure enough to avoid external scrutiny. And now, decades later, he had recycled it in his classroom, as a weapon disguised as a puzzle, knowing full well that anyone who failed would appear simply unworthy. Miles took screenshots of everything. The internal document. The time-stamped creation date. the metadata showing it had been viewed less than 24 hours before the infamous lecture. This wasn't just academic misconduct. It was academic assassination framed under the guise of rigor. Worse, it had been used to reinforce the most damaging of narratives, that black students simply weren't equipped to keep up in elite intellectual spaces. That their failures were proof of inherent limitations, not engineered disadvantage. Miles had always known the playing field was uneven, but here was mathematical proof that the professor had tilted it himself. He drafted a timeline, first the recording, then the archive files. Now the formula, the pattern of predatory logic veiled as scholarship. The weaponization of inaccessible knowledge to shame students of color. Miles knew this couldn't be argued away by university lawyers or public relations teams. This wasn't interpretation, this was strategy. Intentional, traceable, and damning. But what disturbed him most was what the evidence implied beyond his case. How many others had been publicly humiliated and privately destroyed by similar traps? How many had doubted their own intellect, changed majors, lost scholarships, left school entirely? How many names had faded into silence because they didn't have the language or access to prove the sabotage? Miles wasn't just unearthing a puzzle. He was dismantling an entire method of elite gatekeeping. He prepared a new report detailing the origin of the formula, screenshots of Halgrave's private archive usage, and a side-by-side breakdown of the puzzle components mapped directly to Dreadwell's abandoned framework. It read like a scandal disguised as a syllabus. He encrypted the file, saved it to 3 cloud backups under anonymous names, sent copies to 3 trusted alumni who had previously offered support when the protests first went viral. His breathing was calm. Purpose had overtaken fear. But before he could close his laptop, another message appeared on his screen. It wasn't an email this time. It was a remote pop-up bypassing firewalls, system protections, and notification protocols. Just a black window. One sentence in white text. "We warned you once. Don't show up tomorrow." His eyes locked on the words. No sender ID. No metadata. No trace of entry. Then a second line appeared. The last one ignored this. "You already know what happened to him. Darren Westbrook. The car accident. The missing file. The source that never made it to the journalist." This wasn't just intimidation. It was historical. They'd done this before. They were doing it again. Miles closed the laptop. Slowly. The darkness around him felt thicker than usual. Not because it was late, but because now he understood something deeper. The puzzle wasn't an isolated insult. It was a ritual. The university had let it happen for decades. Had rewarded it. Celebrated the elegance of a trap that only punished those who weren't born into the blueprint. And anyone who dared to decode it became a problem to be managed, dismissed, or disappeared. As Miles reached to unplug his hard drive, the campus lights flickered outside his window. And then a low, deliberate knock echoed at his door. The knock at the door had faded, but its presence lingered like residue in the room. Miles stood still, gripping the envelope now in his hand, eyes fixed on the security badge it carried. Dr. Elaine Crosby, a name he'd seen before in buried memos. A ghost of a professor silenced years ago, under vague terms like departmental restructuring and extended sabbatical. Now, without warning or explanation, her ID was in his hands. It wasn't just a message. It was an invitation to witness a fracture from within Harvard's armor. The next day, a hush fell over campus as word spread of another emergency ethics meeting. Again closed door, again without press or students, but this time with one name on the internal schedule that changed everything. Dr. Elaine Crosby was set to speak. Those who remembered her recalled a sharp mind and soft demeanor, someone who never courted controversy. But behind her years of forced silence was a memory too heavy to bury. Inside that sealed room, she stood before the deans, ethics boards, and legal representatives of an institution that once claimed her as one of its own, then quietly erased her when she resisted. In her recorded testimony, which was later leaked, she didn't waver. She spoke not just of what she'd witnessed, but of what she'd enabled through silence, patterns of favoritism, coercion, and systemic neglect of black students, under the guise of academic objectivity. She detailed Halgrave's quiet reign, his ability to humiliate with intellectual precision, his targeting masked as rigor, his reputation protected by a culture too self-interested to intervene. She admitted that she'd seen it coming, years before the first complaint surfaced, and that when she finally spoke up internally in 2009, her courses were stripped, her voice muted, her name omitted from future panels. Her career wasn't ended in a scandal. It was slowly starved behind closed doors. But now, standing in that room, she declared herself done with silence, not to restore her place, but to disrupt theirs. By morning, Harvard retaliated the only way it knew how. A quiet internal notice that Dr. Crosby was placed on immediate research leave. Effective immediate. No formal announcement. No acknowledgement of her testimony. Just a system moving to erase her again. But this time it was too late. The audio had already leaked. Her name was trending across platforms. Headlines reading, "White Harvard professor confirms pattern of racial targeting." I stayed silent too long. Former students emerged with their stories. Think pieces flooded feeds. Crosby's words reignited a national conversation, not just about one professor but about the complicit machinery around him. Miles read each post carefully, feeling both vindicated and hollow, because even with truth on their side, the system was still pushing back. The cost of speaking was still exile. But then, buried beneath the praise and outrage, one comment stopped him cold. It was short, anonymous, and terrifying in its clarity. "She wasn't the only faculty who knew, but she's the only one who broke." Just below that, a new thread appeared, linking to an anonymous document titled, "Signed Faculty Letter of Support for Halgrave, Confidential." The document hit the campus like a rogue wave. A leaked faculty letter signed by 78 professors in silent support of Halgrave, a man now publicly accused of orchestrating years of racial targeting under the cloak of intellectual rigor. The signatories hadn't expected their names to surface, but once they did, the consequences rippled across the university. Students began protesting not just against Halgrave, but against the wider faculty, the ones who had vouched for him, endorsed him, protected him. It wasn't about a single professor anymore. It was about a network, about an ecosystem built to reward silence and punish disruption. Under this mounting public pressure, Harvard responded in its most performative way yet. An official statement was released through every campus channel, across all institutional social media accounts. The statement, with its polished language and curated empathy, announced that Professor Edwin Halgrave had formally resigned. It spoke of shared pain, commitment to healing, and mutual agreements reached in good faith. National media picked it up instantly. "Racist Harvard professor steps down amid campus reckoning." One headline read. Commentators debated whether the university had done enough, whether it had responded too late or just in time. For a moment, the storm appeared to calm. To the public eye, it looked like accountability had won. But Miles knew better. In the hours after the announcement, he began noticing strange inconsistencies. Halgrave's name was still listed in certain internal faculty databases. His office, though cleared of personal items, had not been reassigned. More curiously, payroll files Miles had accessed weeks earlier through encrypted staff channels showed no termination, only a status change. Reassigned to independent research. No resignation date. No contract severance. No indication of departure. It was smoke and mirrors. Halgrave hadn't resigned. He had been relocated, shifted sideways to protect appearances while maintaining status, salary, and silence. Miles cross-referenced departmental memos and found one dated just 2 days prior to the resignation statement, detailing Halgrave's new title, Senior Research Consultant, Remote Academic Liaison. It was nothing more than a disguise, a way to keep him paid and protected while appeasing public outcry. The resignation was a myth, engineered for headlines. Miles sat with the weight of this knowledge pressing hard on his chest. The resignation wasn't a victory. It was another illusion, another manipulation of public perception while the institution kept its machinery untouched. They had pretended to remove the threat while shielding it behind layers of bureaucracy. It was betrayal dressed as progress. He couldn't let it stand. That night, under the blue light of his laptop, and with every digital file organized and verified, Miles went live. No press outlet, no scripted segment. Just him, face visible, voice steady, eyes hard. He streamed on every platform he had access to. TikTok, Twitter Live, Instagram, YouTube. Within minutes, thousands tuned in. Then tens of thousands. Then more. He showed the resignation statement, then the faculty database, then the payroll log. He revealed the internal memo with Halgrave's reassignment, each piece layered carefully to dismantle the lie. His words didn't rage, they revealed. With every click, every screen share, he walked the audience through the deception, step by step, line by line. He wasn't just exposing Halgrave now, he was exposing Harvard, The lie wasn't in the racism. The lie was in the refusal to own it. Within hours, the live stream went viral. News anchors picked it up mid-broadcast. Political commentators debated the legality of reassignment without accountability. Hashtags returned, more aggressive than before. On Harvard hide shade, he never resigned. Protect the performer, not the victim. Miles's name surged across the internet. But alongside the support came the retaliation. Inboxes flooded with threats. Old social media posts were ripped out of context and reposted with sinister captions. Articles appeared attempting to discredit his scholarship, questioning whether his GPA had truly earned him a full ride. One columnist even suggested that Miles was hijacking the narrative for personal gain, reducing months of racial trauma to a media tactic. The Brotherhood was back, not visibly, but in action, calling in favors, planting seeds of doubt. But this time, Miles didn't flinch, because this time, the receipts weren't just his. They were undeniable, public, viral, beyond the reach of institutional edit. Then came the knock. Not on a door, but on his life. At 2:03 a.m., an email landed in his inbox, with a PDF attachment from the university's legal department. The subject line read, "Notice of pending legal action, defamation, breach of contract, unauthorized distribution of confidential material." The message was short, cold, and brutal. Harvard was suing him, not suspending, not expelling, suing. It accused him of maliciously damaging the university's reputation, of falsifying documents, of violating his student conduct agreement, and of engaging in coordinated public defamation of tenured faculty and institutional integrity. The lawsuit was structured like a death sentence for a student, multi-million-dollar damages, legal jargon designed to overwhelm, intentions as clear as day, silence through fear, erasure through litigation. They couldn't stop the story, so they targeted the storyteller. Miles stared at the screen, the floor beneath him suddenly feeling like glass. The weight of it was suffocating. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't rich. He wasn't part of a network of generational wealth that could carry him through this. He was a student, a brilliant, determined, but now dangerously exposed student. And the most powerful academic institution in the country had decided he needed to be broken publicly, not expelled quietly. Their message was crystal clear. If you expose our lies, we'll make sure your truth costs more than you can afford. And yet, somewhere in the depths of that fear, another feeling began to rise. Not rage, not panic, something colder, sharper, a resolve so still it almost frightened him. They hadn't denied the facts. They hadn't disproved the documents. They had sued because they couldn't argue, and that, in itself, was a kind of confession. The institution that taught him critical thinking was now trying to punish him for using it. That irony alone ignited something unshakable inside him. The next morning, as Miles opened his laptop to prepare for the legal battle ahead, a second email appeared, not from Harvard, but from a federal investigator. The subject line read, "We've been watching too. Let's talk." The courtroom didn't feel like justice. It felt like theater. Bright lights, suits polished to reflect legacy, cameras hovering just outside, protesters fenced off across the street. Miles sat at the defendant's table, surrounded by files, exhausted eyes, and a silence that weighed heavier than any gavel. Harvard's lawsuit had turned into a national spectacle. The press had turned it into an ideological war zone, pitting the myth of academic dignity against the lived rage of racial injustice. Inside the courthouse, the walls felt older than the Constitution, and the air reeked of tradition. Miles wasn't up against one professor now. He was on trial against a machine. The university's legal team, a team of 5, moved with robotic precision. They attacked not just the facts, but his character. They painted him as unstable, erratic, reckless with confidential information. They referred to him as the student, never by name, and every question was phrased to reduce him from whistleblower to liability. They paraded policy documents, twisted quotes from old essays, even pulled up a social media post from his sophomore year where he'd criticized elitism. Everything was a weapon. But what struck Miles hardest wasn't what they said. It was how easily they said it, how rehearsed their condescension had become. Across from him sat a table of people who saw him not as a human being but as a threat to be contained. They smiled with sympathy while tightening the legal noose. The trial stretched into days, testimonies from faculty, student records pulled into scrutiny, and footage dissected in slow motion to question and the burden wasn't on Harvard to prove innocence. It was on Miles to prove he belonged in the room at all. Every word he spoke was dissected for arrogance. Every pause was read as uncertainty. The jury listened, but the atmosphere made it clear. Truth wasn't the priority. Optics were. Miles' defense team, two volunteer attorneys from a racial justice nonprofit, did their best to balance legal precision with emotional clarity, but even they looked outmatched. Until the final day when everything changed. In a move no one expected, Miles's attorney announced a surprise witness. There was a shift in the room, a rustling among Harvard's lawyers. A few exchanged glances. The judge approved it, albeit reluctantly. And then quietly, nervously, a woman stepped onto the witness stand. Pale, young, shoulders drawn tight beneath a conservative blazer. Her name was Anna Keene. For years she had served as Halgrave's administrative assistant, managing schedules, booking travel, overseeing lecture prep. She had never appeared in the media storm, hadn't been mentioned once during discovery. Yet now, as she took the stand, the silence in the room became suffocating. Her voice, when it came, was small but steady. She confirmed her role, confirmed her proximity to Halgrave. Then, under direct questioning, she began to unravel the institution's defense. She testified that Halgrave didn't write the puzzle on the fly. He rehearsed it, planned it, pulled it from private theory archives weeks in advance. She had seen the Dreadwell file on his desk, had printed copies of past versions, had even asked him why it wasn't part of the syllabus. His answer, she said, was chilling. He told her it worked better when it wasn't expected, that it only revealed brilliance when no one had time to prepare. She dismissed it then as academic eccentricity. But now, sitting on the witness stand, she saw it differently. Under cross-examination, her words shifted tone. She spoke of years watching students of color leave his lectures looking broken, of how Halgrave kept a private folder titled Resilience Reports where he noted how students responded to being challenged. She never understood the meaning, until now. Then, after a long pause, Anna delivered the line that detonated every defense Harvard had built. She admitted that during the first wave of the scandal, Halgrave had asked her to delete specific folders from his university drive, ones labeled lecture variants, challenge reports, and student behavioral records. She said he told her it was routine, that the university would do it eventually, but he preferred it clean. At the time, she obeyed, but something about the request sat wrong with her, and so in secret, she made copies, saved them to an external drive, documented everything. She didn't tell anyone, not until now, not until the stakes were too high to ignore. She looked at Miles then, the only moment she broke gaze from the table, and her eyes said everything her words couldn't. The courtroom was paralyzed. The defense rested. The Harvard legal team went silent, their expressions unreadable. Outside, reporters scrambled to file updates. The judge ordered a recess, but the impact was irreversible. In one confession, the truth that had been shadowed for months, for years, took center stage. A quiet white assistant had chosen to tell the truth, and in doing so, she'd shattered a billion-dollar institution's foundation of plausible deniability. Miles sat frozen. For the first time, not from fear but from stunned disbelief. He hadn't expected a victory. He had expected survival. But now the narrative was bending, not because of law, but because of conscience. A system that prided itself on rationality had been undone by something rawer: memory, guilt, moral fatigue. As Anna was escorted out, visibly shaking, she turned to the court and whispered something barely audible, but it was caught on a hot mic. The final blow. He told me to destroy the files. I didn't. The courtroom aftermath left the entire campus in a suspended state of chaos, a breath held that refused to exhale. Miles stood in the lobby just outside the judge's chambers, the echoes of Anna Keene's confession still vibrating through the walls like a tremor that would not subside. Her admission that she refused to destroy files, the files that proved an institution had deliberately hidden evidence of racist academic engineering. And in that lobby filled with legal aides, reporters, and students whose eyes lingered on him with equal parts reverence and concern, Miles felt the fragile truth teetering on a razor's edge, between vindication and violent backlash. The media called the trial a circus, but what they failed to recognize was that Miles had not sought spectacle. He had sought accountability, and the truth had become bigger than any one person, now cracking open ancient systems of power that had thrived on silence and privilege, where hidden archives and private support letters had long been the tools of protection for those with tenure and racial entitlement. The defense team, still gathering themselves after Anna's testimony, whispered urgently about remixing strategy, about lodging motions and preparing for the next phase. But Miles barely heard them, his ears still ringing with the sound of systemic complicity and concession. The silence of those who once sat beside Halgrave now pressed into the shape of survival. Weeks passed in a blur of articles, op-eds, heated late-night news segments, and endless social media threads, lit up with calls for justice and denunciations of Harvard's legacy. Alumni debated their own complicity. Faculty issued muted statements that tried to distance themselves from the scandal while defending academic freedom, an abstract ideal they wielded like a shield against accusations of real harm. And through it all, Miles remained a central axis, not because he wanted to be but because he had become the visible proof of every system that tried to operate quietly, invisibly, in the shadows of prestige. Inside dorm rooms and luxury apartments around the world, people dissected every word of Anna's testimony, trying to understand how an institution so revered could behave so callously toward the very students it claimed to uplift. Harvard felt that pressure like a rising tide against its stone walls, and in response its legal team began negotiations behind closed doors, the kind that regular people rarely see and almost never understand in full. The university issued a brief public statement declaring that out of concern for all parties, and in the spirit of moving forward, discussions toward an equitable resolution are underway, a sentence that felt like cold mist on a fire that refused to die. Months of back-and-forth testimony, depositions, settlement drafts and legal counsels, negotiating under confidentiality agreements unfolded without the public ever seeing the documents themselves, until that day when Harvard blinked. Faced with mounting reputation damage, shrinking donor confidence and a terrifying possibility that the court might force the release of those archived files under discovery orders, Harvard's leadership offered Miles a private settlement, significant financial compensation, a promise of future academic support, remediation for other affected students, plus most critically from Harvard's perspective, a gag order. The terms were drafted in complex legal language designed to appear both generous and impermeable, with clauses that granted Miles a payout in exchange for silence on matters directly and indirectly related to the case, including any public disclosure of internal records, testimony details, faculty lists involved in obscure committees, and even anything that touched upon the now infamous puzzle incidents beyond what had already gone viral. In private chambers behind thick oak doors, Harvard's attorneys presented the settlement as though it were the humanitarian option, a magnanimous offer from a confused institution seeking reconciliation. But Miles saw what it was, an attempt to bury the truth under millions and a promise of legal repercussions should he speak beyond the boundary of the agreement. His defense team advised him to consider it carefully. They pointed out the emotional and financial toll the litigation had already taken, the likelihood that even with Anna's testimony the university's power could still wear them down, the very real danger of an appeal dragging the case into years of procedural limbo. But Miles felt something deeper than exhaustion. He felt the pulse of justice outpacing fear. He understood that accepting the gag order would mean his personal victory could never translate into systemic accountability, that the archive revelations and the patterns of institutional protection would remain hidden, protected by contracts and NDAs, while the world saw only sanitized press releases. So, he declined. He refused to sign. And that was when Harvard's legal posture shifted. What had been a proposed settlement became a pressure campaign. The university tried to paint Miles as unreasonable, combative and bent on vengeance, trying to cast doubt on every emotional motive he had. It was a familiar strategy: attack the person, not the truth. They funneled op-eds to friendly networks, funded think pieces, claiming that the court of public opinion had already judged the institution unfairly, that academic freedom was being weaponized by radical activism, that prestige institutions deserved special latitude, because their history was too important to jeopardize for one student's narrative. But Miles didn't bend. Instead, he did something Harvard's lawyers had not anticipated. He released the draft settlement terms online, publicly. No redaction, no embargo. Every clause, every hidden proviso, every name within the document that revealed how many students over the years had been given compensation under confidentiality agreements, how many had been pressured into silence, and how many had been offered hush money without ever being able to tell their own friends or family. Miles published the settlement on his own platforms, and then reposted it across independent news sites, civil rights organizations, forums, and open archives dedicated to academic transparency. He didn't just leak it, he turned it into a searchable database, organized by categories, so anyone could scroll and see in black and white how widespread the cover-ups had been. What Harvard didn't realize, or perhaps underestimated, was that by exposing the settlement itself, the university had opened a new front of accountability. Instead of containing the scandal, the leaked settlement became the scandal. People began combing through it, not just for financial numbers, but for names, dates, and patterns that pointed to a deeper culture of concealment. Digital activists highlighted hidden clauses that forbade victims from discussing not only their experiences, but also the existence of the settlement itself, raising questions about consent, autonomy, and institutional coercion. Former students who had signed earlier NDAs saw Miles's document and felt the first real stirrings of solidarity, the first real possibility that they weren't alone or at fault. Within hours of the leak going viral, online forums lit up with former attendees sharing their own archived emails and private memos that corroborated pieces of the settlement's implications. It was no longer just about Miles. It was about everyone who had ever been quietly compensated, warned to stay silent, or steered away from public accusation because the institution had deemed its brand more important than human dignity. Independent journalists began reporting that the settlement terms revealed patterns so consistent that they weren't isolated incidents, but systemic artifacts, effectively a blueprint for how elite institutions could manage racial controversy without ever taking responsibility. And then, the twist no one saw coming. Legal watchdog groups started to notice that many of the confidentiality clauses in the settlement terms appeared to violate state and federal consumer protection laws, clauses that sought to impose gag orders in ways that conflicted with constitutional rights to free speech and public interest. The discovery created new momentum among civil rights lawyers nationwide, and within hours, a consortium of legal advocates filed a motion to bring the leaked settlement into official court record, arguing that because Miles had published it in the public interest, it could no longer be treated as private. Accusations against Harvard multiplied, not just for defamation counterclaims, but now for possibly engaging in monopolistic abuse of confidentiality agreements to suppress civil rights claims. And as the world watched, the settlement terms, once meant to bury truth, became the weapon that exposed the deepest cracks in the institution's foundation, igniting public fury across communities that had long suspected unequal treatment at elite universities. In the digital uproar that followed, the leaked settlement didn't just go viral, it sparked a federal investigation, with lawmakers citing the document as probable cause to examine whether the university had violated anti-discrimination statutes and engaged in patterns of systemic cover-up. Just as the news broke that a federal probe was imminent, Miles received a confidential tip on his encrypted inbox. Look up the Ellis Amendment in Section 42. Harvard's hidden clause goes beyond gag orders. It ties into restricted research grants and classified academic partnerships. You need to see this. The raw exposure of Harvard's internal settlement, meant to hide decades of racial targeting under layers of confidentiality, triggered a storm that no public relations team, no matter how polished, could contain. Within hours of the document going viral, national news networks dropped every other story to cover the scandal, dissecting every page of the settlement like a crime scene. What had started as a student lawsuit and an Ivy League spectacle turned into a broader cultural reckoning, with pundit activists and legal analysts declaring that the terms revealed something far deeper, a blueprint for how elite institutions systematically contained racial complaints to protect power, reputation, and donors. The outrage wasn't just about one professor anymore. It was about a centuries-old hierarchy that pretended to champion diversity while quietly silencing dissent. Cable anchors read clauses aloud on live television, highlighting provisions that barred victims from even mentioning their own experiences, and critics pointed out how those clauses effectively monetized silence, while codifying emotional erasure. The settlement became lived evidence that racial harm wasn't peripheral, it was structural, and once that truth was out, there was no putting it back in. The political fallout was swift. Within days, congressional hearings were scheduled, extraordinary in scope, not just for one lawsuit, but to investigate whether federal anti-discrimination laws had been undermined by private contracts designed to stifle civil rights claims. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle expressed shock, not only at the content of the settlement, but at how a university of Harvard's stature had thought it could manage racist harm quietly. Subcommittees pressed legal scholars, former students, and civil rights advocates for testimony, demanding clarity on how confidentiality could be weaponized against protected classes. For the first time, American higher education was not just under scrutiny, it was under indictment. The narrative had flipped. What began as a courtroom defense for a single student had become a national investigation into institutional bias, legal loopholes, and the ethics of elite reputation management. On campuses across the country, the movement accelerated beyond Miles's wildest expectations. Silent grievances whispered in dorms and academic lounges erupted into coordinated walkouts at every Ivy League school and many state universities. Black students, immigrant students, indigenous students, and allies walked out of classrooms en masse, carrying handmade signs, digital flyers, and hastily drafted demands for policy reforms that addressed racial profiling, academic bias, discrimination in grading, and the transparent handling of complaints. The echo wasn't just silent or symbolic, it was seismic. Student governments passed resolutions, calling for independent oversight boards. Civil rights organizations offered legal support. Alumni associations split between defenders of the old guard and advocates for truth and accountability. Harvard, once a symbol of unimpeachable prestige, found itself having to answer to its own student body in ways it never had before. The university released statement after statement, each one more defensive and perfunctory than the last. But words had lost their weight. The settlement terms themselves were now public record in multiple forums, republished by advocacy groups and journalists alike, dissected for clauses that made clear the institution's priorities, brand preservation over human dignity, in documents that had once been buried behind NDA walls. Admissions criteria now seemed suspect. Faculty evaluations now appeared tainted by elitist bias. Questions once unthinkable were now mainstream. Had legacy admissions contributed to a culture that valued appearance over equity? Had endowment priorities been shaped in ways that reinforced racial hierarchy? Had students of color been funneled into space but denied power? The questions multiplied, and answers became unavoidable. Amid this turbulence, Miles found himself thrust into roles he could never have envisioned. He was no longer just the student at the center of a lawsuit. He was the symbol of a movement, a focal point for critique and hope. His social media following swelled into the millions, as his live streams and written analyses became required viewing for anyone trying to understand the systemic implications of the leaked settlement. Legal firms offered support, nonprofit think tanks invited him to contribute to policy papers, and civil rights advocates asked him to speak at forums he had only ever dreamed of attending. But deeper than the swirl of attention was something more profound, the knowledge that his pain, his humiliation, and his relentless pursuit of truth had catalyzed something larger than himself, something that refused to be smothered by PR spin or legal intimidation. Congressional hearings were particularly intense. Miles watched on a muted screen as senators from diverse backgrounds pushed witnesses on the ethics of university confidentiality agreements, on whether such settlements should require judicial oversight, on the role of accreditation boards in enforcing anti-discrimination standards. Some lawmakers expressed genuine shock that a centuries-old institution could handle racial complaints in a way that insulated wrongdoing, rather than corrected it. Civil rights advocates testified about the psychological toll of enforced silence, how contracts that barred individuals from discussing their own experiences effectively erased personal narratives in favor of institutional mythology. A legal expert even pointed out that the leaked settlement might run afoul of federal civil rights laws that prohibit discrimination in educational settings. The hearings rippled far beyond Harvard. They were a referendum on the soul of American education, on whether prestige should protect or be accountable to the human beings it claimed to elevate. On campus, in lecture halls, in dormitories, the conversation was no longer just about Halgrave, or even Harvard. It became about power structures that had for generations dictated who could speak, who could succeed, and who could be written out of history. Student governments issued statements of solidarity with Miles, calling for transparent racial equity audits. Faculty members who had stayed silent for years reached out to him privately, some with apologies wrapped in regret, others with offers of support that looked suspiciously like attempts at redemption. But Miles saw through the gestures crafted of convenience. He spoke about authenticity, about responsibility, about how truth could not be bound by contracts or press releases. He reminded people that legacy without honesty was just history, hiding its worst chapters. Unexpectedly, amidst all this uproar, an unlikely group emerged with their own agenda, the same elite board of academic journals who once unquestioningly published Halgrave's work. 3 of them publicly released statements distancing themselves from past associations. But one journal went further. It retracted every publication that cited Halgrave's logic constructs, without peer corroboration, acknowledging in a steep admission that academic review had failed. That journal's editors openly credited Miles's research for forcing a reappraisal of what constitutes academic legitimacy versus institutional privilege. The irony was not lost on anyone. A student had dismantled not just a professor's reputation but one of academic publishing's blind spots. Through it all, Miles maintained a cautious posture, aware that being a symbol wasn't the same as having agency in policy rooms. He continued to work with civil rights legal experts on proposals to reform how universities handle racial complaints, especially settlements that included gag orders. The idea was to propose legislative guidelines that would make certain clauses unenforceable if they touched on civil rights violations, effectively ensuring that no student could ever be legally silenced about discrimination again. As petitions gathered signatures faster than servers could handle, as academic boards began debating whether confidentiality in settlements should be constrained by federal anti-discrimination law, and as student walkouts spread to institutions that had never imagined facing such scrutiny, Harvard took a step it had never taken before. It invited Miles to speak at a public forum in the same hall where he had once been humiliated by Halgrave's impossible logic puzzle. The announcement was as unexpected as it was seismic. The place where his struggle had begun, now a stage for his voice. It was an ironic reclamation, a rewrite of history, by the very man the institution once sought to erase. Miles felt the weight of the invitation like a breath caught in his chest. Acceptance would be more than symbolic. It would be an act of confronting every layer of the system that had tried to contain him. A chance to speak not just as a survivor, but as someone demanding structural change. He understood the moment's gravity. It wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about using that space to expose the forces he had uncovered. The settlement terms, the faculty loyalties, the systemic failures, the ways in which racial harm had been legalistically managed rather than morally addressed. But acceptance wasn't simple. The hall was the same one, where tens of thousands of internal dinner speeches, academic debates, and ceremonial acknowledgments had taken place, all performed under the illusion of meritocracy, all echoing with a legacy that had once excluded him emotionally, intellectually, and institutionally. Now, as the invitation revived that memory, he felt a resurgence of the same tension that had pushed him to stand before that impossible puzzle months ago. Only this time, he would not be a student trying to solve a puzzle he was never meant to decode. He would be returning as someone who had rewritten part of the rules governing prestige itself. As he stared at the formal invitation email, the same hall in which his humiliation had been televised, now a stage for his truth, another message popped into his inbox. This one marked confidential and urgent. We have uncovered a coded amendment in Harvard's bylaws, one that predates Halgrave by decades and was designed to protect donors over students. You need to see this before you speak. The room was impossibly still, the air heavy with expectation, as the final lecture of the semester began, a lecture that was no longer about logic or theory, but about reckoning. Lecture Hall B102, the very space where Halgrave had once humiliated him with an unsolvable puzzle, now held a crowd that seemed impossibly larger than its capacity should allow, a swelling wave of students, faculty, journalists, and observers who had followed his journey. The seats were packed so tightly that the hum of human breath buzzed like electricity, and the glow of cell phones and cameras illuminated the room like stars caught indoors. Miles stood at the podium, the same one that had once reduced him to a moment of national spectacle, and for the first time he felt neither fear nor anxiety. He felt inevitability, as though all the tension that had built since that original impossible challenge had led him here, to this moment of revelation. Behind him, the projector flickered to life, not with inscrutable symbols from an arcane archive, but with a clear reconstructed version of the infamous puzzle, annotated in layers of logic that peeled back its mystique and exposed its design for what it truly was. A clever fabrication built not to test intellect, but to entrench hierarchy, to mask exclusion as challenge. Miles moved through the slides with a calm precision that reflected the countless nights he had spent parsing combinations, translating abstract theory into real meaning, and ultimately showing how the core of the puzzle had been built on a false premise, the Dreadwell variables inserted not as legitimate constructs, but as dead ends only accessible to those with privileged access to archived faculty research, turning the equation into a trap for anyone outside that inner circle. As the lecture progressed, every layer of the puzzle's foundation was methodically deconstructed, revealing not just its unsolvable nature but its intent, the academic equivalent of a locked door masquerading as a gate. What had once been an object of derision became an object lesson, a lesson in how systems invite participation, but then set the terms of success beyond reach for anyone not already inside the circle of power. Miles's voice, steady, resolute, beyond hesitation, guided the room through the logic that explained not only the mathematical flaw but the social implication, that exclusion wrapped in intellectual challenge is still exclusion, and that genius means nothing if the terms of engagement are pre-written. The tension in the hall shifted palpably as the implications settled like dust in sunbeams. Students leaned forward, eyes wide with awe, while some faculty members, those not in the brotherhood of silent complicity, watched with the gravity of realization as their own institution's failings were drawn bare in mathematical clarity. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, understanding instinctively that this was not merely another academic interpretation, but a rebuke of centuries of assumptions about what constituted merit, and who was permitted to claim it. In the far, friends who had stood by him watched with a mixture of pride and catharsis, as though the emotional weight of his journey, the humiliation, the lawsuit, the national storm, the politics and the personal cost, was being transmuted into something universal, something that spoke not only to his own struggle, but to the countless others who had ever been confronted with an unsolvable test, disguised as opportunity. Outside the hall the air was chill and quiet lights settled over the campus that had once seemed so rigid and unyielding, but inside B102, history was being rewritten. When Miles reached the final slide, the one that laid bare the puzzle's origin, its substitution of eerily obsolete academic notation, and the graphical overlay that matched Halgrave's private archived files, the room did not simply applaud, it erupted. It was not the polite clap of academic courtesy, nor the tentative acknowledgement of a clever lecture, but the explosive, sustained recognition of truth laid bare, of a system that had been outsmarted not only at its own game, but at its own design. Headlines would not take long to roll that night. Student outsmarts system, not just professor. Logic reclaimed. How a scholar exposed the ivory tower. Analysis of a puzzle that was never a puzzle. These words would reverberate around the globe, across social platforms and news cycles, not as novelty but as awakening. And yet, just as the crowd's ovation reached a peak, with students rising to give him a standing recognition that transcended applause, with some wiped tears, and others shouted in joyful disbelief at what had been achieved, Miles stepped down from the podium, heart beating not from triumph, but from a quiet and deeply rooted sense of conclusion, each breath heavy with the knowledge that the purpose had always been larger than any single moment. He walked toward the exit, his footsteps swallowed by the residual echoes of the crowd's acclaim, and as he passed rows of faces that beamed with admiration and hope, a freshman barely recognizable beneath a hood pulled low, eyes shining with urgent curiosity, stepped forward from the crowd and extended a folded letter into his hand. It was neither shouted nor announced, it was simply offered in that charged space between victory and quiet expectation. Miles sensed the weight of it before he even opened the envelope, an instinct born from months of navigating secrets and revelations. The freshman drifted back into the dispersing crowd, eyes locked with his for a moment, that felt like an unspoken question. Is the fight truly over? With fingers that felt suddenly heavy with history and possibility, Miles unfolded the letter once he reached the quiet of the hallway, removed from cameras, away from the hall's roar, in the muted lighting where shadows clung to walls like memory. Inside was a single sheet of paper with words that immediately registered not as metaphor but as fact, an acknowledgement that the fallout from his exposure had rippled farther than even he had known. The message claimed that Halgrave was not gone from academia, he had not resigned in any substantive sense, but had quietly moved to a different institution with a reputation for elite secrecy, and a long history of shielding controversial figures under the guise of academic freedom. It was unsettling enough to make his breath catch, but beneath that bombshell was something more surprising, a second line, smaller but unmistakably clear in its implication. It suggested that Halgrave's relocation wasn't just a faculty shuffle, but part of a broader network, a web of institutions that traded professors like rare artifacts, protecting each other's reputations in return for mutual silence about uncomfortable racial history. This was not just a continuation of one professor's career, it was evidence of a networked system of exclusion that had remained in operation long before Miles ever stepped foot in Harvard. The implications of this letter, that the problem was bigger than any one, and that the forces resisting transparency extended beyond a single school's walls, struck him like a physical jolt. Yet it was the embedded footnote at the bottom of the page that finally arrested his breath entirely, a simple line of text that read, See attached 1978 Memorandum Networked Faculty Protection Clause. Miles hadn't just solved a puzzle that was flawed by design. He had exposed a problem with tendrils across the academy. In his mind, the shape of what he was up against changed again, from a single target to an entire constellation of entrenched power. The letter fell from his fingers, and as it drifted to the ground, the next chapter of his journey was no longer a question of academic accountability. It was a confrontation with the invisible architecture that had protected the flawed logic for generations. At the bottom of the unfolded sheet, in small typed print, were the first 3 words of the 1978 memorandum, protected by doctrine, and the rest of the file name, and unseen force. If you believe stories like Miles's shouldn't have to happen for change to begin, type yes in the comments. Would you have stood up if that puzzle was handed to you? Subscribe to hear the truths they don't want told, because silence protects power, and we're here to break both.